as you know, you've made films, you've written about this moment. It's a very distressing, confusing, everything's up for grabs moment. It's right after Andrew Johnson, the new president, had rescinded Field Order Number 15, the order done back in the spring by Sherman, General Sherman, to set aside a huge swath of land along the low country coast for the freed people. And that had all been rescinded. They were being moved out. Andrew Johnson was overseeing the reestablishment of Confederate governments, or ex-Confederates were in these new governments he was putting in place. There was going to be no fundamental reconstruction, it appeared. So it's between that moment of Johnson kind of taking over Reconstruction and all the fears that induced in people, and December, when the Republicans were going to call a halt to this. But Douglass doesn't know that's coming. So it's a pretty despairing moment about Reconstruction. And Douglass had, of course, tremendous hopes for this because, in his view, the greatest single result of this war was, of course, emancipation, and now the 13th Amendment, and now what was to come. But nobody knew just yet. Now, it's a huge question of where we go from there all the way up to now. The question of Reconstruction's legacies, of course, which I think is that piece you may have referred to that I did in Atlantic a couple of years ago. We live the legacies of Reconstruction in this country every day, whether it's in the courtrooms or in Congress and now in the streets. Think about the great racial reckoning we're having right now. What are the issues? They are voting rights. They are the relationships of people to policing. They are the question of the uses of violence by the state. They are the nature of federalism. It's a huge question. What is the relationship of the states to the federal government? Where does the power really rest in this? And there are many more. All of these are essentially the great issues of Reconstruction. What did emancipation mean? What would it mean in law? What would it mean on the ground? What would it mean in the new economy of the South? And as many may know, about 2/3 of all litigation in American courts is in one way or another, even this hour, 14th Amendment litigation, meaning the application of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. What is equality before law? What is equal protection of the law? Now, you brought up John Lewis. Look, everyone has their John Lewis story, I suspect, and we've been hearing on all the airwaves and in the press about his legacies. And that is to be determined over time. Let's hope, against hope, that this particular Congress, even with the Republicans in control of the Senate, or perhaps in the next Congress, we can have even more hope that a new, truly enforceable Voting Rights Act, which has already been written and laying around for 2 years, would get passed and named for John Lewis, because he's associated with no other question quite like the right to vote. I did meet John Lewis at least 4 times. I went on his civil rights pilgrimage in March 3 times, twice to Alabama, once to Charleston. They changed the location the year after the Charleston massacre. So in 2016, it was held in Charleston. These were transcendent experiences where John would assemble with his staff, and his staff was central to this, by the way. A man named John Collins, who was his chief of staff, and then many others. And it was run by an organization in DC called Faith and Politics. And they would gather at least 200 people on one of these pilgrimages, mostly Congress people themselves and their staffs, always trying to make them bipartisan, although I must say, and the 3 I went on, there were precious few Republicans. But Lewis himself, I think, would strong arm some of them and make them come. But you went to the sites of the civil rights movement in Montgomery and in Birmingham, and then ultimately it always ended on Sunday in Selma and the reenactment of the march across the bridge. And then everybody would stand in line to have their photograph taken with John Lewis on the Pettus Bridge. I always wondered how he endured all of that. To me, John Lewis represents, and this is just a personal reaction, he is to me he's like a living Hebrew prophet. He was almost like an Isaiah walking around among us, a sweet one, an absolutely kind, gentle, utterly peaceful man, except when his passion kicked in. And then he became the powerfully passionate Isaiah as well as the sweet man, chastising us, warning us, calling us to the altar. But he was like an Isaiah walking around in the blue suit of a congressman, reminding us of somehow a conscience about America's creeds. To me, he represented, when I had those few privileges to see him, be with him, meet him, share some scrambled eggs over breakfast, and in some hotel in Alabama. But he was to me like this living in the flesh, prophetic kind of person, reminding us of what America can be. He was a ferocious patriot in that sense, not unlike Frederick Douglass was, radical patriot, demanding the best in us, a complete and thorough and total believer in democracy, which is, democracy is hard, as we are learning now in this new authoritarian age. So, here we are. We've lost a John Lewis. What do you do about that? Well, legislation. John Lewis wouldn't just want monuments built to him, although that may yet occur. And we can come back to the issue of monuments. But the greatest monument to John Lewis would be a thoroughgoing Voting Rights Act that no Supreme Court decision can turn around. That's the best we can probably hope for.
He also had a capacity for forgiveness. Isn't he noted for forgiving? Is it Trent Lott over the Strom Thurmond I forget.
Yeah, he's had these kinds of reconciliation moments. I'm not even aware of them all. With many people, you may remember that on one of the pilgrimages, I was not on this one, but on one of the pilgrimages, I believe it was the chief of police of Birmingham, Alabama, in a ceremony in a church, turned over his badge to John Lewis as a way of saying an apology from the Birmingham police of the Bull Connor era. He had many of those moments, and he was the kind of person people could do that with, and not only know that it was sincere, but somehow they learned from it.
Yeah.
I can remember John speaking. We visited at least 2 churches in Charleston on that pilgrimage, 3 actually, including Emmanuel AME, the famous church where the murders occurred. And this was his message: hard-nosed, hard-boiled, kind of very Old Testament. But it was that, people had to see into evil, face it, try to forgive it, but then build a better world out of it. That was always his approach. Now, not everybody can do that. In fact, very few of us can. It appears to have come in John Lewis from a deeply Christian place. And you just have to acknowledge that, not unlike Martin Luther King, not unlike many, as C.T. Vivian, who was himself, of course, a preacher. John was not an ordained minister, but everything but.
He was out there preaching to the chickens.
Absolutely, yeah, that's in his autobiography. He was a political preacher, and he's one of those people that transcended generations too. I think he could speak to young people in ways some lifetime politicians just have perhaps forgotten how. 32 years in the Congress, that can make a cynic out of a lot of people. It just wasn't who he was. They don't come along very often like this. And he is a person, of course, that can't be invented. John Lewis is born of experience. I mean, he was 17 years old when he, in effect, tried to become an activist and entered the movement. He always said he met Rosa Parks when he was somehow 17 years old in Alabama, and he meets King when he's 21. And God, what was he, 24 when he spoke at the March on Washington? I mean, that's like Douglass getting up in the early 1840s when he was 23, 24, and 25 years old and addressing these anti-slavery audiences, or sometimes pro-slavery audiences, with a voice he was just developing in the form of oratory. You know, I never got to have that kind of conversation with John Lewis. It's just who had most influenced him. Clearly, the leaders of the civil rights movement had, but it would have been such a joy to just, you know, have that fireside chat someday and say, who over time did you read and look to, you know, but, you know, everybody would have wanted to have that experience. I don't know, you know, we have to take these leaders and not just make them into heroes. You know, there's so much talk now about heroes, especially over the monuments issue, and this notion that we have to find the new heroes and so on. I'm personally wishing, not that John Lewis is not an authentic hero, he is. He's one of those rarest of people. But I'm wishing we could begin to rethink and reimagine the idea, not just of monuments, but of memorialization, perhaps away from heroes, even away from individual leaders, and into ideas, to concepts, to events, to processes, you know, over time. Because the problem here is that anybody deemed a hero 200 years ago is probably going to have some flaws and some ugly parts today. Anyone, name your figure. Saint Francis of Assisi may have held up well. You know, Jesus holds up well. But even some of the Hebrew prophets were tough, terrible people at times. People hated Jeremiah. Good Lord, he made everybody uncomfortable. You know, nobody built any monuments to Jeremiah. He made everybody uncomfortable. So, you know, he wasn't deemed a hero. He was deemed a problem. So I don't know if we could only, but I don't know that we can. You know, we're a culture that is into looking for the next set of heroes, believing youth cannot function without heroes. But the whole idea of hero has been so skewed in modern times by celebrity and athletics and entertainment and the cult of political leadership. You know, that's one of the things Trump has managed to appeal to, the strong man, heroic figure. And he's proven that lots of people out there are still waiting for that kind of person. I don't know that we can educate that out of ourselves. I'm just, I guess, wishing we could.
Well, there are some parallels, or maybe you can discuss parallels with Douglass and what you're saying about Lewis, who on the one hand could forgive or hold a vision while really calling people to account, or calling the nation to account. What you had pointed out, what is it called? The Composite Nation that Douglass articulates in 1867, where he calls for a multi-racial, multi-ethnic. He even uses that phrase.
He does.
And at the same time, here he is kind of on the stump saying they're not coming through on Reconstruction. They're giving it all back to the vanquished to go at us again.
Yeah, well, that speech by Douglass, the text we have of it is 1869, but he probably writes it there in 67, 68. Is an amazing speech in its sheer modernity. You know, it reads at times, if you read it, it reads like a multiculturalism manifesto from the 1990s, or as I've said in print, it reads sometimes like a mission statement of today's universities and corporations and so on. And it sounds so current. But it came out of a very optimistic moment in Douglass's career. a fairly short time, but it's in that period between, the passage of the 13th, 14th, the 15th Amendment is being passed. It's about to appear, the Voting Rights Amendment. You've had the Civil Rights Act of 66. The Reconstruction Acts are in place. It looks like Reconstruction is in place. It has a chance to succeed. The South's going to be remade. The freedmen have been given, well, political rights and some civil rights. And this incredible new beginning, Douglass believed in world history, had begun. So he says in this speech, America has a chance here to do something no other place has ever done. A nation of accumulated peoples from all corners of the earth, all races, religions, backgrounds, tongues, languages, bring them all together and find a way for all of them to live under the same set of creeds, and especially equality before law and the 14th Amendment. Now, it was an audacious kind of dream, but it was and he's not alone in this. There were other abolitionists, former abolitionists, who did this. They argued that the Civil War had crushed the first American experiment and gave birth to a new one, as many of us scholars now call it, the Second Founding. Eric Foner's most recent book is entitled Second Founding. It's a study of the three great amendments. The second Constitution, if you like. Douglass saw this now as an ideology that even should be exported. I call him in my book a kind of a soft imperialist. He thought this new ideology of egalitarianism and equality before law, the abolitionist ideology, should be exported to the Caribbean, to other places where forms of slavery, all kinds of exploitation still existed. Now, that's going to be a problematic agenda through the course of the 19th century. And he gets caught in it when he was U.S. Minister to Haiti in 1889. But that speech comes from that kind of incredibly hopeful moment. But Peter, I cannot find a case of him giving that particular speech again after about 1871, because the story of Reconstruction, of course, began to shift then. It doesn't turn totally dark for another, 3, 4, 5 years in the wake of the Panic of 73. But what's happening soon is, almost overnight, is the Democratic Party's counter-revolution of white supremacy and the redemption, as it was called, of the southern states. But in the middle of that speech, which anyone can find now online, you can pull it right up, he makes a case for Chinese immigration, which is amazing. It just comes. It's kind of startling, and he spends several pages on it, because at that moment in time, the late 1860s, they're becoming a big issue in the West. And of course, the Chinese laborers are working on transcontinental railroads. They're working in mines. They're already making a community in San Francisco, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The Chinese are coming, and Douglass says, "Deal with it, America. Get ready. The whole world is coming to America." And yet he says things like, yes, the Chinese have an alien language, they have an alien religion, but he says, look, this is a 3,000 or 4,000 year old civilization. They have invented all kinds of things. They have created scholarship we don't even know. They're bringing us ideas. And he uses classic American move here. He uses an assimilationist model. He said, don't worry. They're very different, but they'll assimilate, because we have this now set of creeds that all the world can buy into. Well, that was an audacious idea. And it's remarkable, because right at that time, of course, the anti-Chinese immigration movement is beginning. And the first Chinese Exclusion Act actually came in, I think, 1874, which was directed against women. And then the big one happened in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. But it's typical of Douglass. It's full of these metaphors of nature. The Chinese are coming out of the West. They're coming over the mountains. They're coming over the rivers. They're coming to join us. Now, think about that even in our own moment now. The immigrants are coming. The immigrants are coming. They're going to join us. They're going to make us stronger. That's 150 years ago. He's making that argument. And today, that is still at the heart of our politics. And that's a Reconstruction issue. That's
Yeah.
born of Reconstruction's ideology and the realities of the new immigration. Immigration, of course, was cut off during the Civil War by and large. After the Civil War, it's not only resumed from Europe, but now it's coming from Asia, which is the bulk of the world. And Douglass says, don't be scared.
Yeah.
Let them join our experiment. It doesn't mean he was always, on the right side of everything here. But we can come back to that.
The current discussion sparked by George Floyd's murder now, we're at the 2-month mark this week. His May 25th killing is remarkable for a number of reasons that I'd like you to address. But one that strikes me is the kind of facility that the discussion has with moments in our history, both positive and negative. The idea that in 1965 we had a Voting Rights Act and a Civil Rights Act, and in 1865, 66 we had a Voting Rights and a Civil Rights Act and the other formal steps of congressional reconstruction. But the fact that history is so actively part of the current dialogue must be striking to you as a historian who's labored in the vineyards on these topics and attempted to bring them to larger audiences outside of the university and scholarship. What do you think it means that history is back with us? Are we really reckoning with our long struggle with race?
Yeah, well, we probably are really reckoning. We being whatever the we is, our collective society. There's no question about that. The sheer scale of people in the streets of all backgrounds, races, etc., tells us that. But what it also tells us, it seems to me, it's hard to know even where to begin with the George Floyd killing and all the various other police killing or abuse events. But surely what it became is one of those moments that I like to refer to as the shock of events. There are many of them in history. Sometimes they're way out there, like Pearl Harbor, that launches World War II. Or they're like 9/11 that happened here on our own soil and launched the war on terror and a very different kind of reckoning. This world of terrorism against our system and even against our ideology. Assassinations fit this case, the Kennedy assassination, the King assassination. Events that virtually everyone suddenly finds they have to position themselves to. And when people do that, they yearn for historical footing. They want to know, how did this happen? How did we get here? Where are we in time? Now, as historians, and you know this, as historians, we always want people to be very reflective about the past, and we want them to have a deep sense of history and so on and so on, but most people don't. However, what we do know is that everybody has a sense of the past in their heads. They got it from their family, they got it from their schools, their churches, their communities. They got it somehow. They have a narrative, a story in their heads. And when a huge shock of an event occurs, that story in their head gets either affirmed or utterly disoriented. And this is kind of what's happening with this rediscovery of racism. I mean, I actually am I have to confess, I'll just be honest here, I'm a bit tired of hearing this phrase now, 400 years of racism, 400 years of racism. Yes, there's been 400 years of racism. But what does that even mean? I mean, how do we enter the story? What are the entry points? What did it mean in the 16th century, the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th? It is not an utter constant. It changes over time. Everything changes over time. Nothing is static. But to be a historian in this moment, it's astonishing, frankly, Peter. It began for me in my field, and let's face it, if you study Slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, and Race in America, you study, if not the central thread of our story, certainly a central thread. You make your top three of the most important factors in American history, and this is there. So if you study this and you've managed to write some things on it, and if you have this burning desire to reach a broader public, which of course has always been your passion through film, then you're going to have a chance to have a voice, you hope. And people are yearning for that. Where I learned this, well, I've learned this many times, but in the wake of the Charleston massacre, this is what I would compare this moment to. In the wake of Charleston, that shocking, horrifying mass murder in a black church. I mean, what could be more horrid? By a white supremacist kid, with his mind twisted inside out by neo-Confederate madness. Yeah. In the wake of that, yes, the Confederate flag came down to South Carolina, and then monuments started to come down here and there. And the whole world was asking, what's happening in America? There was a period there of about 2 to 3 months in the summer of 2015 when historians, especially Americanists in my field, had never had so many media requests ever. It was unbelievable. In fact, the AHA, the American Historical Association, actually kept a record of them. First, it was in the hundreds, then in the thousands of historians being asked to reflect on this from all over the world. I had calls from newspapers in New Zealand and Australia and Denmark and all over the place. And sometimes they would ask questions like, what was this thing called the Confederacy? And you'd, in 2 minutes, you'd try to explain it. Or they'd ask things like, why doesn't America ever get over this? Good question. If you got an hour. Or you might want to read a book called Race and Reunion, or any 10 others I could name. But then the same thing happened in the wake of Charlottesville. That remarkable, stunning mass march of white supremacists in numbers that people were shocked by. And then, of course, there was Trump's reaction to it. And of course, the context for all of this, we need to remember, is the Charleston massacre occurs in the early summer of 2015, the same month Donald Trump announced for the presidency. And in the ensuing year of the primaries and the election of 16, we got the election of this demagogic, authoritarian, white supremacist candidate who seized the Republican Party and then had those unfortunate things to say after Charlottesville about nice people on both sides and so on and so on, fueling this, we hope, racial reckoning in America. Reckoning's a good word. Racial crisis is another way of putting it. Racial polarization is another way of putting it. And then, of course, comes this spring. In the midst of a horrifying pandemic, the end of which nobody knows and understands, Americans and the world got to watch a lynching. Now, most people happily never have that experience of literally watching a version of a lynching, an 8.5-minute murder of a man on a street. It was so now there've been many dozens of other black men mostly killed by police over the last 7-8 years since Trayvon Martin, or by people standing in for the police. So there was already a litany of this story, and the Black Lives Matter movement is, of course, several years old. Yep. But here we were again facing this story. But the George Floyd event, it fits now in it's one of those cases among these others mentioned of the shock of an event that forces everybody to reposition themselves. And Americans of various stripes have been falling all over themselves to now claim or understand or help explain or live up to or face this question of racism. And I have to say, for historians, this is both exhilarating, I think. I can't speak for all of my colleagues, but I think for myself anyway, it's exhilarating in the sense that, you know, you feel relevant when you get asked to comment, when you get asked to write something, or you get a chance to use your voice on this. But it's also distressing sometimes to realize how simplistic our views of the past are inevitably across the gamut of American society, and for that matter, across the world. There have been moments in these months when I hear commentators on television, I read in my newspaper, I read online, people just pontificating about American history. It's all this or it's all that, and so on. And you, of course, as a historian, you want to take people by the lapel and say, whoa, slow down. And this is part of our dilemma as historians. How do you have a voice that sometimes is expected to be a soundbite in the midst of this kind of crisis? But what historians do, of course, is try to develop a long view. We do context, chronology, and complexity. And that is not what people always want to hear, you know, especially when it comes to monuments. Tear them down. Well, wait a minute, there's a context for this. Or America's been racist to the core and all of its institutions from the very beginning. Well, wait a minute, now things changed over time. There are victories that have been won and losses and so on. But, you know, you try to be a voice of a long view. And many people want that. There's no question. Educated people who've had a history course, if it's taught well, know that everything has a history. Everything. And there's a yearning right now to know more about this. You can see that from the bestseller list. You can see it from conversations on television. I've been astonished how many historians have started to appear on TV. In fact, I was one morning on MSNBC with the Morning Joe program with Eddie Glaude and everybody else, and they let us go for like 20 minutes, at least 25 minutes. And I got a bunch of emails after that from people who said, yeah, not all of them, but people who said things like, God, I wish they'd do this more often. They should have more seminars like this on television. I thought, yeah, it's a good idea. Let's have the history hour. You know, why not? As long as you get historians on who know how to speak to the broader public and don't, you know.
You have studied the struggle for the memory of these events in Race and Reunion, and in a lot of your writing, you're describing the way the meaning of the Civil War and lead-in and aftermath have been kind of taken over or aimed to serve a reconciliation solution. And where we're at a moment where we seem to at least need, if not radical, we need significant change that looks at these experiences openly.
Yeah, well, you know, I and a number of others have written now books on this question of how Americans have processed and fought over the meaning and memory of the Civil War, which means the meaning and memory of slavery and the meaning and memory of Reconstruction. It's the most divisive element of our national memory. Where does a country, a culture that keeps striving to be some kind of democracy fit an all-out civil war that killed over 700,000 of its people into a story of progress? If indeed people believe that it is a story of progress, that's part of the problem to begin with. There isn't necessarily any natural progress in history. However many times you want to use or say that quote that Obama borrowed from King and King borrowed from somebody, the arc of justice always bends, or the arc of history always bends towards justice. My reaction to that has always been, what a wonderful idea, but too bad it's not true. And the essence of that book, Race and Reunion, and now, and other scholars too have have developed us even more. And that book's now 19 years old. But it was that Americans found in the reconciliation of North and South, of the blue and the gray, of the story of valor of both sides, of struggle by both sides, and even of a kind of glory and defeat on the Confederate side, a story to reunify around. Not everybody, by any means. There were always dissenters to this. But they found in that reconciliation story, 25 years, 30, 40, 50 years after the Civil War and beyond, they found a narrative that not only left Black people out, but diminished, if not dissolved, the deepest meanings of that war and its aftermath, which was slavery, emancipation, the establishment of new visions of liberty, new visions of equality, new visions of constitutional rights, such that by the 1890s into the early 20th century, the Confederate lost cause version of the Civil War had gained a national audience.
Yeah.
I recently wrote this piece in the New Yorker about lost cause ideology, and I tried to imagine, I don't know if it worked, but I tried to imagine that maybe, just maybe, we may be finally experiencing a historical moment now in which, especially with all of this hostility to Confederate symbols, monuments, et cetera, in the wake of George Floyd, but of course this goes back to Charleston, maybe, just maybe, the lost cause as an ideology has finally had its day. I'm not sure I'm predicting that. It's not dead. In fact, I had just yesterday one of the most racist emails I've ever had from somebody who didn't sign their name about what they thought of a recent piece I had in the Times on monuments. But I compared our moment now, at least loosely, to 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, when the ideology around communism had kind of run amok, had become exhausted. The Soviet Union was dissolving as an economic phenomenon, as an ideology, and the world, for a while at least, had the right to believe that somehow democracy was rising. Well, we all know that did for a while, all over Eastern Europe and around the world, but that didn't last either, did it? There are always actions and reactions in history. That's one thing we can be sure of. But I do wonder if the lost cause ideology now is so on the defensive, so in hiding. I mean, here we were watching Confederate monuments torn down and nobody was stopping them. No police, nobody, just take down a Lee, take down a Jackson, take down Jefferson Davis. We're still waiting for all those 13 Confederate monuments inside the U.S. Capitol to be removed. We need to find out if Republicans will really do that. But we may finally have the lost cause as an ideology on the run. But never say never, because white supremacy is never going to die as long as there are disgruntled, angry white people who still believe that a system or a country or a place essentially belongs to them and not to all these other people who seem to be taking over. But I think we as historians can do a lot to help usher this lost cause ideology into not just the dustbin of history, not at all. We need to always teach about it, learn about it, read about it, understand it. Because there have been many other lost causes in history, and look what they led to. There was a big lost cause in Germany after the First World War, and look what that led to. There was a big lost cause in France after the Franco-Prussian War, and look what that led to, etc. So I don't know. I think there's been no other moment in my lifetime when historians have at least been asked to be relevant, quite like now. So we have to seize the moment and give people good history. Our job shouldn't be just to have political opinions. I mean, we all have those as well, and I've just expressed a few. But our job is to help people think in time. Think historically. Think with context. And above all, perhaps, as hard as it is, to remember that there is no purity in history and there's no purity in your memory of the present. You can't purify the past, and you can't purify the present by just choosing new heroes.
Well, David, it's been terrific to be back in touch and to get your perspective on all these questions. I had wanted to address what you have been discussing about how you practice history in the midst of upheaval. And
Yeah.
you've given us a clear indication of how you meet that responsibility. And I think you're going to have to keep on it as much as you have research and writing to do. We need the voice and perspective of you and your colleagues as we try to make sense of the current moment and keep it going forward. Trump is clearly going to stake out literally a Confederate honor, Confederate history position. So we need the counterweight.
Well, I have a dilemma, Peter, in that I don't really do social media. I've just never joined Facebook. I have a Twitter account that I don't use. And I know that that's where a lot of the action is. And I just have to confess that I try to write op-eds now and then when I can have something to say using history. But I just have not entered that social media world, and so I may go to my passing, letting the world fight this out on social media. But happily, there are still people who read newspapers, read the New Yorker, read the Atlantic, read the Washington Post.
Your arguments make their way through people who pick up your ideas and perspective and put it out, or they repost your articles and your news media appearances. So we get you on social media. You don't have to change cultures. So to
Well,
speak.
that's good. That's good because I'm not sure I can.
All right. Well, baseball starts at the end of the week. We get a break, and I hope you get a chance to watch a game or two.
Yeah, it's manna from heaven. I even watched an intra-squad game the other day from Detroit with no umpires and one announcer, and still it was just to hear the smack of the mitt was a little piece of heaven in the midst of chaos.
All right. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to the Gloucester Writers Association. This was great fun. Thanks.
All right. See you later.